On the morning of October 14, 1987, a fire alarm sounded at Whitfield Elementary School in Creel Hollow, Virginia, a small Appalachian town of fewer than 4,000 souls, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where nothing terrible was supposed to reach. 409 students filed out of the building in orderly lines. Teachers swept the hallways. The principal stood at the front entrance with a clipboard. When the head counts finished, 4 children were missing. A full sweep of the building found empty classrooms, an overturned chair in room 14, and a single red crayon on the floor. No sign of struggle. No witnesses who could say with certainty what had happened. No trace of 4 living children who had been seated at their desks 11 minutes before the alarm sounded. Tobias Drummond, age 10. Petra Vance, age 9. Callum Ashby, age 10. Nora Blythe, age 8. They were never found. 37 years later, a demolition crew dismantling the old school building would drag back a concrete slab in the basement sublevel, a section that appeared on no architectural drawing filed with the county. What they found beneath it would unravel every official explanation Creel Hollow had ever offered, and expose what certain people in that town had spent nearly 4 decades making sure the rest of the world would never see. This is the story of those 4 children, of the town that failed them, and of the few people who never stopped looking. If you believe the forgotten deserve more than a closed case file and a town that moved on, subscribe. She had been 22 years old that morning. Margot Hale, Margot Sisson now, though she had not fully grown into that name even after 30 years of wearing it, could still recall the exact quality of the light. It was the particular pale gold of an Appalachian October morning, the kind that sits low and sideways across a field and makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and slightly wrong. She had been a teacher's aide at Whitfield Elementary for less than 4 months. She was young enough to still find the children charming rather than exhausting. She had not yet developed the teacher's practiced numbness. The fire alarm sounded at 9:41. She remembered the time because she had been watching the clock above the classroom door, counting down to her coffee break. The alarm's flat metallic scream filled the building, and the children shot to their feet with the electric energy of an unexpected interruption. She remembered the teacher, Miss Crane, already moving to the door with the calm precision of someone who had done this many times. They filed into the side yard. Margot had been at the back of the line, herding the stragglers. The morning air was cold enough to show breath. Children milled on the grass in approximate clusters, while teachers moved between them with clipboards. The fire trucks came at 9:53. She remembered this too, because she had been annoyed by how long it had taken them. It was sometime in that interval, in those 12 minutes of controlled disorder, that she saw them. She had looked toward the eastern tree line, a dense wall of oak and cedar that pressed against the back edge of the school property, and she had seen 4 children standing at its border. She recognized 2 of them. Tobias Drummond, with his dark jacket. The small girl everyone called Nora. They were not running or playing. They were standing still, facing the trees, and they appeared to be watching something just inside the wood line that Margot could not see from where she stood. Then one of them, she believed it was Tobias, took a step forward, moving toward the darkness between the trees, and the others followed. Margot had turned to alert Miss Crane. Miss Crane was no longer standing near her. Margot had looked back at the tree line. The 4 children were gone. In their place, there was only the dark geometry of the trees and the pale yellow light moving across the grass, and a stillness so complete that for a moment she questioned whether she had seen anything at all. She spent the next 30 years telling herself she must have been mistaken. She was not mistaken. The GPS lost its signal 3 miles outside Creel Hollow, which struck Vivian Lark as appropriate. She had driven the last stretch by feel, following a 2-lane blacktop that wound through second-growth timber and over a series of low ridges before the town materialized through the trees. A steeple first, then a water tower, then the low, flat geometry of Main Street emerging from the foliage like something that had been hiding. Vivian pulled her car to the shoulder at the top of the final rise and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking down at Creel Hollow, the way a doctor looks at a chart before entering the room. She had learned to do this, to take a town's measure before it took hers. She had been covering true crime for 11 years, first in print, then through her own newsletter, and for the past 4 years on the True Stories Vault channel, which had grown to an audience she still found faintly bewildering. She was 44 years old. She had reported from small towns in Louisiana, from rural Nebraska, from the Pine Flats of central Georgia. She understood, in the way that only repetition can teach, what a place looked like when it was holding something back. There was a quality of stillness to those towns that went beyond ordinary quiet. A kind of managed surface. Creel Hollow had it. She drove down into town just after 11 in the morning on a Thursday in early April. The demolition of Whitfield Elementary had been in the news for 6 days, first locally, then picked up by 2 national outlets after the medical examiner confirmed the remains were human and almost certainly belonged to multiple individuals, at least some of them juvenile. The story was still developing. Vivienne had driven 8 hours from Nashville the moment she read the Second Wire report. She found a room at a motel on the south end of Main Street, a low building with an exterior corridor and a parking lot that smelled of pine sap and old motor oil. The woman at the front desk was in her 60s, compact and watchful, and she had registered Vivienne without asking any questions beyond the necessary ones. In Vivienne's experience, that silence was itself a form of communication. She walked to the site that afternoon. The old school was 3 blocks north of downtown, set back from the road on a wide lot that had clearly once been the largest piece of public property in Creel Hollow. The building itself was mostly gone. 2 exterior walls remained standing at the north end, their brick faces spalling and dark with moisture, surrounded by the organized debris of demolition. A chain-link fence had been erected around the perimeter. Construction tape wound through it at intervals, and 2 county sheriff's vehicles sat on the access road. A handful of workers stood near a flatbed truck at the far end of the lot, talking in low voices, not working. They had the flat, unsettled posture of men who had seen something they were still trying to categorize. Vivienne stood at the fence for a long time. The site had been frozen in place since the discovery 4 days earlier, pending full forensic processing. She could see the rectangular depression in the earth at the building's southern foundation, the area she knew from the initial reports where the basement sublevel had been breached. Police tape formed a bright orange rectangle around it. Someone had placed a portable light stand at each corner, though in the afternoon light they were not yet switched on. The lamps reminded her, unpleasantly, of the arrangement around a grave. She took photographs. She noted the sight lines from the school's original eastern face to the tree line beyond, a distance of perhaps 200 yards of open field, now gone to scrub and saplings. She noted the way the old tree line pressed close to the property's edge. She had read enough about the original disappearance to know that some early investigators believed the children had gone into those woods. No one who went in after them had found a trace. On her way back to the motel, she passed a small diner on the corner of Church and Main. Through the window, she could see it was mostly empty. She went in, ordered coffee, and sat where she could watch the street. 3 separate people walked past the diner and glanced in through the window. All 3 of them looked away when they saw her. She was a stranger in a town that had learned to regard strangers with a particular wariness. Not the wariness of unfriendliness, but the wariness of people who knew that strangers tended to arrive asking about the same thing. She was halfway through her coffee when the man slid into the booth across from her. He was in his early 70s, she guessed, heavy-set, with the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of hard weather. His face was deeply lined, his gray hair cut short and neat. He wore a canvas jacket, and he set his hat on the table between them with the care of a man who had been taught that hats do not belong on heads indoors. He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "You're the journalist," he said. It was not a question. "Vivienne Lark," she said, extending her hand. He shook it with a firm, dry grip. "Dale Odom. I worked that case for 22 years. He looked at her steadily. "I've been waiting for someone to come back to it." She set down her coffee cup. Then I'd like to hear what you know. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the street. What I know, he said carefully, is going to take more than one conversation. He looked back at her. And some of it, some of what I know, is going to be hard to make sense of. Because what happened to those 4 children didn't happen the way the town decided to tell it. He paused. It happened the way the town decided not to tell it. There's a difference. Vivienne reached for her notebook. They met the next morning at Dale Odom's house. It sat on a gravel road 2 miles east of town, a modest white frame house with a wide porch and a barn that had given up trying to stay upright on one side. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and old paper, and the front room had been arranged in a way that made its function immediately clear. A folding table against one wall held 4 large binders, their spines labeled in careful handprint. A corkboard above the table was dense with photographs, maps, and documents connected by lines of red string. In the center of the board, level with the eye, were 4 school photographs, the kind taken in early September against a blurred blue studio background, the children squinting slightly under the photographer's lights. Tobias Drummond, Petra Vance, Callum Ashby, Nora Blythe. Vivienne stood before the board for a long moment before she said anything. She had seen similar arrangements in the homes of obsessed men before, cases that had colonized the available space of a life until there was no room for anything else. But there was a difference between obsession and obligation, and what she felt standing in Dale Odom's front room was the latter. This was not a man who had made the case his identity. This was a man who had been unable to put it down because putting it down would have meant agreeing with the town that these 4 children were simply gone. I didn't catch the case originally, he told her, pouring coffee at the kitchen counter and bringing 2 mugs out on a tray with the unhurried precision of someone who lived alone. The sheriff in '87 was a man named Corbett Hale. He ran the investigation for the first 18 months. I was a deputy at the time, junior enough that I wasn't in the room for most of the key decisions. He settled into the armchair across from her and wrapped his hands around his mug. When I made sheriff in 1994, I pulled every file we had on those 4 children. It took me 3 months to read through all of it, and when I finished, I had one very clear conclusion. He looked at her. The original investigation had been deliberately contained, he said. Not sloppily handled, not under-resourced, deliberately limited. There were interviews that should have happened and didn't. There were locations that should have been searched and weren't. There was a person of interest who was named in 2 separate witness statements and whose name appears nowhere in the official file. Who? Vivienne asked. A man named Forrest Creel. He said the name the way you say something you have said thousands of times and never gotten used to the sound of. He owned farmland about 4 miles northeast of town, ran some cattle, did some contract logging. He was 51 years old in 1987. He had lived in Creel Hollow his whole life. His family had been in this county since before the Civil War. Dale looked out the window. He employed 6 men at various times. He was a deacon in the Baptist church. He lent money to people when the farms were struggling in the mid-'80s. Half the town owed him something. What was his connection to the children? That's what I spent the better part of 8 years trying to establish formally enough to act on. Dale leaned forward. What I could establish informally, what I believe now as firmly as I believe anything, is that Forrest Creel had been taking an interest in certain children in this town for years before 1987. He had access through the church, through community events. He was the kind of man who knew how to make himself useful to struggling families. The kind of man who offered to drive children home from events when parents couldn't make it. The kind of man who was present at the edges of children's lives in ways that only look suspicious in retrospect. Vivienne wrote without looking up. Were any children before 1987 reported missing or harmed? Dale was quiet for a moment. Not reported, he said. But I spoke over the years to 4 adults in this county who told me privately, not on record, not in statements, that they had experiences with Forrest Creel as children that they had never told anyone. What they described was gradual, targeted, and it had been going on for a long time before Tobias Drummond and his friends disappeared. His voice was level, the flat, controlled tone of a man who had learned to discuss horrific things without letting his voice do what it wanted to do. Creel knew which children were most isolated, which parents were distracted by hardship or illness, which kids would be less likely to be believed. The room was very quiet. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the trees and then went silent. "When did Creel die?" Vivienne asked. "February 2019, cancer. He died in his bed at home with his wife present." Dale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was 73 years old. He died without being charged with anything, without any finding against him in any court. As far as the official record of Creel Hollow, Virginia is concerned, Forrest Creel was a respectable man who died peacefully. He stood and crossed to the corkboard. With one finger he tapped a name written on a card in the lower right corner of the board, a name connected by a red line to Forrest Creel's photograph. The name read, Harold Mast. "The janitor," Vivienne said. "The janitor," Dale confirmed. "He disappeared the same day as the children. Every official account of the 1987 case treats Harold Mast as the primary suspect, a guilty man who fled." He looked at her. "I don't believe that. I haven't believed it for a long time. I think Harold Mast saw something that morning that he was not supposed to see, and I think what happened to him afterward was not the act of a guilty man running." He paused. "I think Harold Mast is somewhere in the ground near those 4 children. And I think the bones they found under that school are going to begin to tell us that." Vivienne looked at the corkboard, at the 4 school photographs, at the red lines running between names she had only begun to learn. She thought about Margot Sisson, who had watched 4 children walk toward a tree line and then looked away. She thought about the teacher who had been standing at the back of the line, and then, in the chaos of a fire drill, had simply not been. "I need to speak with Elspeth Crane," she said. Dale looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not quite reluctance, and it was not quite warning. It occupied some space between the two. "I expected you'd say that," he said. He turned back to the corkboard and was quiet for a moment. "Just know that Elspeth Crane has been telling the same story for 37 years. She has told it so many times and with so much consistency that I think she may have forgotten it's a story." He crossed to his chair and sat down heavily. "She was the teacher on duty when those children vanished," he said. "She had them in her classroom from 8:15 until the alarm sounded. She filed a report stating she had visual contact with all of her students until the moment the head count revealed 4 were gone." He looked at Vivienne. "I have a witness who puts Elspeth Crane inside the building, walking back inside through the side door, approximately 6 minutes before the fire department arrived and 5 minutes before anyone realized the 4 children were missing." Vivienne was very still. "She was inside the building," she said. "For at least 5 minutes," Dale confirmed, "while the children were unaccounted for. While, according to her own statement, she was standing outside watching over them." He folded his hands in his lap. "I tried twice to get the state AG's office to look at that discrepancy. Both times the request went nowhere. Corbett Hale's shadow was a long one, even after he died. Outside, the wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and the bare branches tapped against the window glass, a sound that was just ordinary enough to ignore and just rhythmic enough to notice." Elspeth Crane lived at the end of a short, dead-end street on the north side of Creel Hollow, in a brick ranch house surrounded by a garden that had once been tended with care and was now winning its slow argument against the gardener. The flower beds were overgrown. The boxwoods at the front corners of the house had grown enormous and slightly menacing, pressing against the eaves as if the house were being slowly absorbed. A ceramic rooster stood on the porch railing, glazed in fading colors, one wing chipped away at the tip. It was a Saturday morning, cool and overcast, when Vivienne parked at the curb. She had not called ahead. In her experience, advance notice gave people time to re-rehearse what they had already decided to say, and Elspeth Crane had been rehearsing for 37 years. The element of surprise rarely produced confessions, but it occasionally produced something more useful. The unguarded pause, the micro-expression that preceded the careful answer, the eyes moving in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. Vivian had learned to read those small betrayals. They were often the only honest thing in an interview. The woman who answered the door was 81 years old and carried it well, straight-backed, well-dressed in a pale blue cardigan, her white hair set with the careful attention of someone who expected to be seen. Her eyes were sharp and gray, and they assessed Vivian in the half-second before her face arranged itself into an expression of polite inquiry. "Mrs. Crane," Vivian said. "My name is Vivian Lark. I'm a journalist. I'm in Creel Hollow because of the discovery at the old school, and I'd very much appreciate a few minutes of your time." Something moved across Elspeth Crane's face. It was too fast to name precisely. Not fear, not anger, not the weary resignation Vivian sometimes saw in people who had been interviewed about old tragedies before. It was something more like the expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular knock on the door for a very long time, and, now that it has finally come, is not entirely surprised. "You'd better come in," she said. The interior of the house was warm and orderly. Vivian noted immediately that there were no photographs of children on the walls, no classroom pictures, no commemorative group shots, none of the sentimental record-keeping that retired teachers often surrounded themselves with. The walls held a reproduction landscape, a needlework sampler, a mirror in a gilt frame. A small bookshelf in the hallway held a Bible, several novels, and a row of decorative plates. It was a home that had been carefully emptied of a certain category of memory. They sat in the front room. Elspeth served tea that she had clearly not just prepared. It was already steeped and waiting, which meant either that she regularly kept tea ready at 10 in the morning, or that she had seen Vivian's car from the window and had spent the intervening 2 minutes composing herself. Vivian accepted the cup and said nothing about it. "I assume this is about October 14th, Elspeth said, settling into her chair with the deliberate care of someone managing joint pain. "Everything is always about October 14th in this town." "What do you remember about that morning?" Vivian asked. The answer came without a pause. "The alarm sounded at 9:41. I moved my students to the side yard in an orderly fashion. We were outside approximately 40 seconds after the alarm began. I counted my students as we exited the building. I had 23 present that day, and all 23 were in the yard." She looked at Vivian with level, gray eyes. "When the fire department completed their check at approximately 9:55 and we began the formal head count, we discovered 4 students were unaccounted for." It was smooth. It was precise. It was, Vivian recognized, the verbal equivalent of a document, language that had been revised and finalized and was no longer subject to editing. "Do you have any idea how they disappeared?" "None. The investigation determined they had moved away from the group and likely entered the wooded area to the east of the property. Children do unpredictable things during the excitement of a fire drill." She lifted her teacup. "I have given that answer many times." "I know," Vivian said pleasantly. "I've read every interview you've given. You've been very consistent." Something shifted infinitesimally in the gray eyes. "I'd like to ask about Harold Mast," Vivian said. Elspeth set her teacup down. She did it with great precision, placing it exactly in the center of its saucer. "Harold Mast was the building janitor. He was not a man I knew well. He disappeared the same day." "Yes." "What was your impression of him?" The pause this time was measured. Not long enough to seem evasive, but longer than the previous answers. "He was a quiet man, kept to himself. He did his work adequately." "Were you aware that he had raised concerns with the principal about unauthorized access to the school's lower level?" Vivian watched Elspeth's face as she asked it. "In the months before the disappearances?" The pause was longer this time. "I was not the principal. Those would not have been matters brought to my attention." It was not a denial. It was a redirect. Vivian noted it. "Mrs. Crane, I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll consider it in the spirit it's meant." She kept her voice conversational, unhurried. "A witness has told me they observed you re-entering the school building through the side door during the period when the students were in the yard, approximately 5 to 6 minutes before the head count was completed. Is that possible?" The silence was the longest yet. Outside, a car passed on the street. The ceramic rooster on the porch was dimly visible through the front window, its one chipped wing turned toward the glass. "I may have gone back in briefly," Elspeth said at last. Her voice had changed. The precision was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, like a floorboard that had held for years and was now considering its options. "I may have realized I had left the attendance clipboard inside. I don't recall exactly." "You've never mentioned that in any previous interview." "I'm 81 years old," she said. "My memory is not what it was." Vivian looked at her steadily. "Your memory for the rest of the morning has been exact to the minute for 37 years. No answer. Elspeth Crane looked at the middle distance between them, at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who had decided, a very long time ago, exactly how much she was willing to carry, and had arranged her life accordingly around that weight. Vivian thanked her for the tea and left her business card on the side table. As she walked back down the front path to her car, she had the distinct sensation of being watched. She turned once, at the gate. Elspeth Crane stood at the front window, framed by the gap between the two enormous boxwoods, her face very still, her gray eyes following Vivian's movement down the street. She did not look away when Vivian looked back. She simply watched, with the patient, practiced stillness of someone who had waited out many things, and believed she could wait out this, too. Vivian got in her car and drove without turning on the radio. She was 3 blocks away before she realized what had been bothering her about the front room. On the small bookshelf in the hallway, between a novel and the row of decorative plates, there had been a child's drawing in a wooden frame. Rendered in crayon, the way children render things, blocky figures, a yellow sun, a green hill. She had noticed it peripherally and filed it away without examining it. Now, replaying the image in her mind, she understood what she had seen. In the lower right corner of the drawing, a child had printed their name in the large, uncertain letters of someone who had recently learned how. The name was Nora. The medical examiner's name was Dr. Adeze Wandu, and she drove up from Richmond on Monday morning in a state vehicle with a cracked windshield that she had been trying to get requisitioned for 6 weeks. Vivian had found her through the county sheriff's public information office, had sent a formal request for comment on the forensic findings, and had received no reply. She had then found Dr. Wandu's professional profile through the state medical examiner's database and had sent a second message, this one more personal in tone and specific in detail. The reply had come within 2 hours. "I'll speak with you briefly, outside only. Bring your own coffee." They met in the parking area beside the chain-link fence surrounding the site. The morning was gray and cold, the sky sitting low over the tree line, and the field beyond the demolished building had that particular drained winter look. The color of old dishwater, the grass lying flat under its own weight. Dr. Nwandu was in her mid-40s, compact and direct, wearing a heavy coat over her work clothes. She accepted the coffee Vivian handed her and looked at the site over the rim of the cup for a moment before speaking. "I'm going to tell you what I can tell you professionally," she said. "The investigation is ongoing. I will not characterize any finding as conclusive because nothing has been formally concluded." "Understood," Vivian said. "The sublevel space is approximately 22 feet by 14 feet. It is not on any architectural plan filed with Grange County, which means it was constructed or modified without permit, or the permit records were expunged." She paused. "I am told by the demolition crew supervisor that the concrete slab covering it bore no markings, no access hatch, no mechanical or utility connections. It was essentially sealed. The slab appears to have been poured over an existing entry point. Vivian kept her voice even. When? Based on the concrete's weathering and composition, our current estimate is sometime in the late 1980s, possibly as late as 1990, not later than 1991. She drank her coffee and looked at the site. The space had not been accessed since sealing. The atmospheric conditions inside, because of the depth and the concrete seal, were relatively stable, low humidity, limited temperature fluctuation. That matters for what was found. Which was? Dr. Nwandu was quiet for a moment. We recovered a total of 12 discrete sets of skeletal remains, she said. Some are complete or near complete, others are fragmentary. She looked at Vivienne carefully. I want to be clear that formal identification is pending DNA analysis, which will take time. I will not confirm identities. 12. Vivienne absorbed that. 4 children had vanished in 1987. 12 was 3 times that number. Were any of the remains consistent with juvenile age at time of death? She asked. Several, Dr. Nwandu said. I won't specify how many. Were any consistent with an adult male, possibly in his late 40s to mid-50s at the time of death? Dr. Nwandu looked at her with an expression of professional neutrality that had a question behind it. You've been thorough, she said. Harold Mast, Vivienne said. The janitor. I am not going to comment on specific individuals, Dr. Nwandu said. What I can tell you is that the remains span a range of ages at time of death, from juvenile to middle-aged adult, and that the forensic evidence currently under analysis, dental if applicable and osseous, suggests the deaths did not all occur at the same time. She paused. There appears to be a temporal spread. The implications of that sat between them in the cold morning air like something physical. How wide a spread? Vivienne asked. That analysis is ongoing. Dr. Nwandu lowered her coffee cup. What I will tell you, not for direct quotation, not attributed, understood? Understood. There were artifacts recovered in the space along with the remains. Items of clothing, personal effects. Among them were school materials, notebooks, a lunchbox, small personal items consistent with what children carry. She looked out at the site. One of the items was a red crayon, still in its paper wrapper. The paper was legible. A pause. The brand name on the wrapper had a production date printed in the industry code. We looked it up. That particular crayon wrapper design was in production from 1985 to 1989. Vivienne thought of the original case file summary she had read before driving to Creel Hollow. She thought of the detail logged by the first officers on scene, the overturned chair in room 14, the single red crayon on the floor. That crayon, she said slowly, was it in the sublevel space or in the building above? In the space, Dr. Nwandu said, along with the remains. She looked at Vivienne, which tells us that whatever happened to the people in that space, at least some of it happened with them conscious and present. That crayon did not walk itself down there. She finished her coffee and folded the paper cup in her hand. I have to go back in, she said. I expect this will be a significant news story within the next week, regardless of what I say or don't say. Do your reporting responsibly. She walked back toward the site access gate without looking back. Vivienne stood at the fence for a long time after she left. She looked at the rectangular hole in the earth with its ring of portable lights now switched on against the overcast morning. She thought about the children who had walked toward a tree line and then been gone. And she thought about a sealed concrete room beneath a school that had been filled and then buried and then stood on for 3 decades, while children sat in classrooms above it, and teachers wrote their names in grade books, and janitors swept the corridors, and the town of Creel Hollow arranged its surface into something that looked, to a passing eye, exactly like ordinary life. She thought about 12 sets of remains, and about a temporal spread she had not yet been given numbers for, and about the fact that 4 missing children in 1987 did not come close to accounting for what lay in the ground beneath that building. She thought about Forrest Creel, deacon and landowner, dead in his bed in 2019. She thought about Elspeth Crane, framed between her boxwoods, watching without blinking. She thought about a child's drawing in a wooden frame, signed in large, uncertain letters by a girl named Nora, who had vanished at the age of 8, and whose body might, even now, be part of what Dr. Mwandu's team was painstakingly cataloging in the February cold. She took out her phone and called Dale Odom. He answered on the second ring. 12, she said when she heard his voice. They found 12. The silence on his end lasted exactly 4 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and quieter than before, the voice of a man who had suspected the worst for 37 years and had just been told he had not suspected enough. I need to show you something, he said. Tonight. Come to the house. Dale was waiting on his porch when Vivian pulled in, which meant he had been watching for headlights. The night was clear and cold, the sky over the ridge dense with stars the way it only gets far from city light, and the air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. He held the door without speaking, and she went in ahead of him. The front room looked the same as before, except that the folding table had been cleared of the binders and now held a wooden box, the kind used for filing index cards, and beside it a manila envelope that had been opened and resealed with tape more than once. Dale poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the table, and then sat across from her, his large hands flat on his knees. What I'm about to show you, he said, I've shown to 3 people in 30 years. One was a state investigator who took photographs, and then I never heard from him again. One was a reporter from Richmond in 2003 who wrote 4 paragraphs about it and buried it at the bottom of a story about local tourism. He looked at her steadily. The third was a woman named Audra Mast. Vivian looked up from her notebook. Harold Mast's wife, his widow, as far as she's concerned. She died in 2018 at 87 years old. She spent the last 31 years of her life in a nursing home in Roanoke. Before she lost her clarity entirely, around 2011, I drove up and visited her 4 times. He reached for the wooden box and opened it. Inside, standing upright in their card slots, were not index cards but small, folded pieces of paper, notebook pages, edges soft with age. Harold Mast kept notes. Not a diary exactly, just observations, things he noticed and couldn't do anything about directly. Dale lifted one carefully between 2 fingers and unfolded it on the table toward Vivian. His wife had these. She showed them to me in 2001. I had them photographed, and she kept the originals until she died, at which point they came to me from her son in Roanoke, who wanted nothing to do with any of it. The handwriting was small and cramped, pencil on notebook paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream. Vivian leaned over it. FG in the building again after closing. 3rd time this month. Came in through the coal door. I locked it last Tuesday and Thursday, and both times the lock was turned by morning. He has a key, or he has someone who can make one. Principal Barlow was with him on Thursday. I saw them come out of the lower level together at 8:40 p.m. Neither man saw me. I don't know what to do with this. FG, Vivian said. Forrest Creel. Dale unfolded a second note and placed it beside the first. There are 41 of these in total. They span approximately 14 months before October 1987. Harold Mast noticed Creel's presence in that school and recorded it with the careful diligence of a man who knew something was wrong, but was not sure whether what he had was enough. Vivian read the second note. Barlow told me the lower-level storage is off-limits for maintenance now. Gave no reason. I've been the maintenance man in this building for 9 years, and there has never been a restricted area. I asked him what was stored there, and he said equipment. The room on the east end was cleared out entirely in March. I don't know what replaced what was there. Principal Barlow, she said. He died in the 90s, you mentioned. 1998. Natural causes. Dale said the words with the economy of a man who had made his peace with inconvenient timing long ago. His wife still lives in the county, 84 years old. She and I have spoken 3 times, and she maintains she knew nothing about her husband's activities after hours. I have no specific reason to disbelieve her. He paused. Though I will say that she moved into a larger house in 1988 on a principal's salary, and I have always thought about that. He opened the manila envelope and removed a photograph. It was a black and white photocopy of an original, the resolution slightly degraded by age, but the subject was clear enough. It showed the eastern corner of a school building, Whitfield Elementary, recognizable by the brickwork along the base, and a man in a long coat standing near a low-set window that Vivian recognized from her visits to the site as the coal door Harold Mast had referenced. The man's face was partially turned away, but his profile was visible. Forrest Creel, Dale said. Harold took this with a disposable camera he bought at the drugstore. He developed it himself at a 1-hour photo lab in Harrisonburg so no one locally would see it. He looked at the photograph. This was taken 6 weeks before the disappearances. Harold dated the back of the original in his own hand. He knew, Vivian said quietly. He had been building a case on his own. He had been doing what a cautious man with no institutional power does when he suspects something terrible, Dale said. He was documenting it carefully, waiting until he had enough, not yet sure enough to go to anyone, because the one person in authority he might have gone to, Principal Barlow, was clearly involved. He sat back. And then, on October 14th, whatever had been building in that lower-level room reached the surface. 4 children vanished, and Harold Mast, the one man in the building who had been watching and recording, also vanished. And Corbett Hale ran an investigation that named Harold Mast as the prime suspect and quietly closed every avenue that might have led somewhere inconvenient. Corbett Hale, Vivian said. She had looked up the former sheriff before coming to Creel Hollow. He had died in 2007. His son, she knew, was currently a county supervisor. She had written the name down when she found it and underlined it once. How close was Corbett Hale to Forrest Creel? Dale looked at her across the table. They were cousins, he said. First cousins. Their mothers were sisters. They had been close their entire lives. He folded his hands. That is the fact I spent 22 years trying to find a way to make matter in an official context. And every time I got close, something stopped me. A retirement, a reassignment, a file that was no longer where it was supposed to be. His voice remained steady, but Vivian could hear the geological weight beneath it. The accumulated pressure of decades of blocked effort. Still there, still present, just compressed into something that no longer moved or showed. Creel is dead. Barlow is dead. Hale is dead. What I have now is bones in a room, and notes from a dead janitor, and a journalist who drove 8 hours. He looked at her directly. I hope that's enough. Outside, the wind moved the bare trees along the property line, and their branches tapped and scraped against each other in the dark. And somewhere, far down the road, a dog barked once, and then went quiet. Margot Sisson lived in Charlottesville now, in a brick townhouse on a street full of similar brick townhouses, the kind of neighborhood that had been built in the early 90s for young professionals and had aged gracefully into middle-class permanence. She taught ESL at a community college 3 days a week. She had a daughter in Portland and a son in Charlotte, and grandchildren she visited at Christmas. Her life had the settled outward calm of someone who had worked deliberately for a long time to make it look exactly that way. She opened the door on a Tuesday morning and looked at Vivian with eyes that held immediate recognition, not of Vivian personally, but of the category of visit. She had clearly been expecting this, not because she had been warned, but because she had been expecting it for 37 years in the particular way that people wait for things they simultaneously want and dread. "Come in," she said. "I saw the news about the building." They sat in a small sitting room off the front hallway. Margot Sisson was 59 years old, angular and composed, her graying hair cut practically short. She kept her hands in her lap and she looked at Vivian with an expression that was preemptively resigned, the look of someone who has made a decision before a negotiation begins. "I want to say something before you ask me anything," she said. "Of course," Vivian said. "I have not spoken publicly about what I saw that morning because I spent years convincing myself I was wrong, that I was a 22-year-old who was overwhelmed and confused and misread something ordinary." She paused. "I am no longer 22 years old, and I have not been confused about what I saw for at least 25 of the past 37 years. I chose silence because I was afraid. I'm saying that plainly so you don't have to maneuver around it." Vivienne nodded. "Tell me what you saw." Margot told it the way the prologue had told it. The pale October light, the fire alarm, the side yard, the tree line to the east. She described seeing the 4 children standing at the border of the wood line with a precision that was clearly the product of having replayed the memory so many times it had been worn smooth and exact simultaneously. She described Tobias Drummond taking the first step forward, into the trees, and the others following. She described turning to find Miss Crane no longer standing near her. "When you turned back," Vivian said, "they were gone. In the time it took me to turn my head and turn back," Margot said, "which is maybe 3 seconds, 4, they had been perhaps 60 yards from me. At a dead run, a child could not have covered the distance to the trees in 3 seconds." She looked at her hands. "I have thought about that for 37 years, the physics of it, whether it was possible, whether I miscounted the seconds or misremembered the distance." She looked up. "I haven't misremembered. The distance was about right and the time was about right, which means either those children moved in a way I cannot account for, or they didn't go into the trees at all. Where else could they have gone?" "Back into the building," Margot said quietly, "through the side door, which Elspeth Crane was apparently walking through at approximately the same time." Vivian was still. "Have you always suspected Elspeth Crane?" The pause was long and careful. "I have always remembered that she was not beside me when I turned. I have always remembered that she was not in the yard when I looked for her immediately after. And I have always remembered something else, something I didn't include in my official statement in 1987, because I was 22 years old and frightened and didn't understand what it meant." She turned and looked at the window. "When I saw the 4 children at the tree line, I noticed that 2 of them were holding something. Small items, bright colored. I assumed at the time they were toys or snacks, something from their pockets. I forgot about it almost immediately in the chaos afterward." She paused. 3 days after the disappearance, I was cleaning out my car and I found something under the passenger seat, something I had no memory of putting there." She rose from her chair and crossed to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened the lower drawer and removed a clear plastic bag, sealed with a twist, and brought it back to the table. Inside the bag was a crayon. Red, still in its paper wrapper, the wrapper worn but legible. Vivian looked at it without touching it. "I don't know how it got in my car," Margot said. "I have no memory of picking it up. I have wondered, for a very long time, whether one of those children dropped it as they passed, whether they were being led somewhere, that morning, and one of them reached out toward the nearest adult and left the only thing they had." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I should have taken it to the police in 1987, I know that. I was frightened and confused, and I made the wrong decision, and I have lived with it for nearly 4 decades. She set the bag on the table between them. "Take it," she said. "Take it to the forensic team. Maybe it matches something they found in that room. Maybe it doesn't. But it doesn't belong in my cabinet anymore." Vivian picked up the bag carefully. The crayon inside was the same deep red as the one described in Dr. Nwandu's account, the one recovered from the sub-level space with its production date intact. She did not yet know if they were from the same batch, the same box, the same small hand. But the weight of the bag in her palm felt specific and serious, the way certain objects do when the accumulated significance of many years has concentrated inside them. "There's something else you should know," Margot said, settling back into her chair. She looked older now than when she had opened the door, as if the telling had drawn something out of her. "In the spring of 1988, 6 months after the disappearances, I received a phone call. A man's voice, low and quiet. He said only one thing." She looked directly at Vivian. He said, "You didn't see anything," and then he hung up. Vivian looked at her steadily. "Did you recognize the voice?" Margot was quiet for a moment. "It took me 20 years, she said. "But yes, I heard that voice again when Forrest Creel gave a eulogy at a church function broadcast on local radio in 2007. I was visiting my mother in Creel Hollow, and it came on in the kitchen." She stopped. "I knew it the instant he spoke. I sat down on my mother's kitchen floor, and I could not get up for a very long time." Outside on the quiet street, a car went past with its windows down, music drifting briefly through the air and then gone. The sitting room was very still. The plastic bag with the red crayon lay on the table between them like a small, terrible gift. The county supervisor's name was Grant Hale, and he was not easy to reach. Vivian had submitted a formal interview request through the county offices on Wednesday, received an automated acknowledgement, and heard nothing further. She had left a voicemail with his personal assistant and sent a follow-up email. She had waited 48 hours. On Friday afternoon, she drove to the county government building on the south side of Creel Hollow, a flat one-story brick structure that smelled of industrial carpet and fluorescent lighting, and asked at the front desk whether Supervisor Hale was available. He was not available. He was, the young man at the desk told her with the careful neutrality of someone following instruction in a meeting that was expected to run through the afternoon. Vivian thanked him and sat down in the waiting area with her phone and a cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway, and she waited. Grant Hale emerged from his office at 4:47. He was in his early 60s, heavier than his county website photograph suggested, wearing a gray suit and a loosened tie, and he saw Vivian the moment he pushed through the inner door. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who has been anticipating an unpleasant thing for long enough that, now that it has arrived, he has shifted into a mode of deliberate control. He crossed the room and extended his hand. "Ms. Lark, I apologize for the delay. My schedule this week has been complicated." His handshake was firm and brief, and his eyes were his father's eyes, the same flat, measuring quality, though set in a softer face. "Come on back. I can give you 20 minutes. His office was standard county government sparse. Framed photographs on the wall showed him at ribbon cuttings and community events, shaking hands at various outdoor ceremonies, standing with groups of men in the organized posture of official functions. Vivian noted that in none of the photographs was there any image related to Whitfield Elementary. No groundbreakings, no school event appearances. She noted that the office also contained, on the credenza behind his desk, a framed portrait of Corbett Hale in his sheriff's uniform, the same photograph she had found in the county archive. "I want to be straightforward with you," Grant Hale said, settling into his chair, "out of respect for your time and mine." "I'd appreciate that," Vivian said. "My father ran a thorough investigation in 1987. He devoted significant resources to it over 18 months. The disappearances were never resolved, which was a tragedy, and I know it has weighed on this community for decades." He folded his hands on the desk. "The discovery at the school site is deeply disturbing. The county is cooperating fully with the state forensic team, and we want answers as much as anyone. You're aware," Vivian said, "that the current forensic findings suggest the remains in the sub-level space are significantly more numerous than the 4 missing children from 1987. A brief pause. "I've heard preliminary reporting. 12 individuals," Vivian said, "with a temporal spread that may extend several years beyond 1987, which suggests the activity connected to that space did not end with the fire drill disappearances. It continued, potentially for years afterward." She watched him. "While your father was still sheriff." The pause this time was longer. Something moved in Grant Hale's face. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has spent his adult life in the gravitational field of a secret large enough to bend everything around it, and has learned to move through that field by not looking directly at its center. "My father was not a corrupt man," he said. His voice was quiet and careful. "I want to say that clearly. Whatever relationship existed between him and Forrest Creel, whatever decisions were made in 1987 that may look different in retrospect, my father was not a man who would have knowingly allowed children to be harmed." "What about unknowingly?" Vivian asked. The silence this time lasted a long time. Grant Hale looked at the surface of his desk. He looked at the framed photograph on the credenza. He looked for a moment like a man standing at the edge of something steep, calculating whether the jump was survivable. "I found a letter," he said finally. His voice had dropped in register. He was not looking at her. "After my father died, in a safety deposit box at his bank, which his will directed me to, along with financial documents and his mother's jewelry, there was a sealed envelope with my name on it." He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed an envelope. White, business size, the paper slightly stiffened with age, and placed it on the desk in front of Vivienne without looking at her. "He intended me to find it. I don't know what he intended me to do with it." Vivian looked at the envelope. It had been opened and resealed, as the manila envelope at Dale's house had been resealed, with the careful tape of someone who had opened and closed something many times. "What does it say?" "Read it," he said. "I'd rather not speak the words." She opened it with care. The letter inside was handwritten in a tight, slanted script, dated March 2006, a year before Corbett Hale died. It was 2 pages, and she read it slowly. It confirmed what she had already assembled, and it confirmed several things she had not yet been able to prove. Corbett Hale had known about Forrest Creel's access to the school. He had not known, or had chosen not to fully know, what Creel was doing there. When the children disappeared, and Harold Mast disappeared alongside them, Creel had come to Corbett with what the letter described as an explanation that named Harold Mast as the responsible party. Creel had been specific, persuasive, and had provided what appeared to be corroborating detail. Corbett Hale had believed him, or had needed to believe him, and had shaped the investigation accordingly. The second page was harder to read. Corbett Hale wrote that in 1991, 4 years after the disappearances, he had found something on Creel's property while investigating an unrelated trespassing complaint. Something that made him understand that he had been used. That what he had believed was a one-time act of violent disorder was in fact something far larger and longer and more deliberate, something that had been operating in his county for years, possibly decades, beneath the surface of a community he believed he knew. He had not reported it. He had confronted Creel privately, and Creel had told him, with the calm certainty of a man holding all the available cards, that Corbett's own role in the 1987 cover-up, however unwitting, was enough to end him professionally and criminally. That what Corbett had was not evidence. That what Creel had was leverage. So Corbett Hale had done nothing. For 16 more years, until he died, he had done nothing. And in a safety deposit box, to his son, he had written down everything he knew and sealed it in an envelope, and told himself that was sufficient. Vivian set the letter on the desk. "The State Attorney General's office needs this today," she said. Grant Hale nodded slowly. He looked, she thought, genuinely relieved. The way a man looks when a weight he has been carrying alone is finally in other hands, even if the transfer comes at cost. "I know," he said. "I've known since the day I found it. I just needed someone to make it necessary." He looked at her with the honest, stripped expression of a man no longer performing anything. "I'm sorry it took so long." She left his office with a photograph of the letter on her phone, and the county supervisors signed consent for its release, and she sat in her car in the parking lot for a full 5 minutes before she started the engine, thinking about how many different kinds of silence a person can choose and what each one costs and who pays the final bill. The call from Dr. Nwandu came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Vivian's first visit to the site. It was early, just past 7, and Vivian was in her Nashville apartment with coffee going and her notes spread across the kitchen table in the particular organized chaos that accumulated around a story in its final stages. She had been back from Creel Hollow for 11 days, filing preliminary reports, coordinating with the state AG's office, corresponding with Dale Odom daily. The story had broken nationally 9 days prior, picked up first by 2-wire services and then by every major outlet within 48 hours, the way stories of a certain density eventually do, all at once, as if everyone had simply been waiting for the first person to push. Creel Hollow had been briefly everywhere: satellite trucks on Main Street, reporters in the diner, the site surrounded by a larger perimeter. The county supervisor had made a public statement. The state had appointed a special prosecutor. Vivian had declined 14 requests for television appearances and had kept working. "I want to give you the formal findings," Dr. Nwandu said. "Before the press release goes out at noon, you'll want time to understand what you're reading." Vivian pulled a clean notepad in front of her. "Go ahead." The forensic identification process had taken 3 weeks of DNA analysis, dental record comparison, and consultation with physical anthropologists. Of the 12 sets of remains recovered from the sublevel space, 8 had been formally identified. The remaining 4 were still in process, pending sourcing of appropriate comparison samples. Dr. Nwandu read the names without inflection, the careful neutrality of the professional in the presence of irreducible fact. The first 4 names were the ones the town of Creel Hollow had been saying for 37 years. Tobias Drummond, Petra Vance, Callum Ashby, Nora Blythe. All 4 confirmed, all 4 present in the room they had disappeared toward on the morning of October 14th, 1987. The room they had entered, Vivian now believed, based on everything she had assembled, through the building's side door, led by a woman they trusted, to a place they were told was safe or interesting or necessary in the way that adults tell children things. The 5th confirmed identification was Harold Mast. His remains were found in the north corner of the space, partially beneath a section of collapsed shelving. He had been in that room as long as the children. He had not fled. He had not been a suspect. He had been a careful man who documented what he saw with the tools available to him and had been silenced before he could bring his notes to anyone who might have acted on them. Dale Odom, when Vivian called him an hour later, was quiet for a long time after she said Harold Mast's name. Then he said, very softly, that he was glad the man's wife had not lived to hear it, and also that he was glad the man's wife had known, in the way that grieving people sometimes know, that her husband had not run. The remaining 3 confirmed identifications were names Vivian did not recognize. 2 were adult women, one in her late 20s and one in her mid-30s at time of death, reported missing from adjacent counties in 1989 and 1991 respectively. Their cases classified as runaways or voluntary disappearances, never linked to Creel Hollow or to Forest Greel. The 3rd was a child, an 11-year-old boy named Perry Hatch, reported missing from a neighboring community in the summer of 1990. His case had been handled by a different county sheriff and had remained open, unresolved, for 34 years. His mother was 71 years old and still living. Vivian wrote his name down and underlined it. She would find his mother before noon. The temporal spread confirmed what Dr. Nwandu had suggested at the fence. The room had been used over a period of at least 4 years, 1987 through 1991 at minimum, possibly longer pending the 4 unidentified individuals. What had happened in Whitfield Elementary on October 14th was not an isolated event. It was a point on a longer line that Forest Greel had been drawing for years, confident in the protection of his cousin's badge, his pastor's collar, his banker's ledger, and the bone-deep small-town logic that certain men are simply above the accounting. He had been wrong about the accounting. He had only been right about the timing. Vivian filed her story at 11:47 that morning, 13 minutes before the official press release. It ran at just over 4,000 words, the complete picture assembled from 6 weeks of reporting. It named every name that the evidence supported. It traced every line from the children to the room, to the man, to the sheriff, to the 37 years of official silence. It was the most complete account she had ever produced of anything, and when she read it back before filing, she felt the particular hollow satisfaction that comes with finishing something that should not have been necessary. She would rather the story had not existed. She filed it because it did. The response was immediate and enormous, and she paid attention to very little of it. What she paid attention to was a text message from Dale Odom that arrived 40 minutes after the story published. It said only, "Thank you. I'm going to go sit in the yard for a while." And a voice message from Margot Sisson, left in a voice that was thick with something that was not quite crying. She said she had read the story. She said she was sorry it had taken her so long to say what she knew. She said she hoped the parents of those children could feel something now. Not peace exactly, because she was not sure peace was the available thing, but some end to the particular uncertainty of not knowing, of searching, of a question that had been kept open by design for nearly 4 decades. Vivian listened to the message twice. Then she gathered her notes from the kitchen table and stacked them carefully and put them in the accordion folder she used for closed cases. She made a fresh cup of coffee. She stood at her kitchen window for a moment, looking at the ordinary street below, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck making its rounds, 2 children on bicycles navigating the sidewalk with the full concentrated effort of the young. She thought about 4 children standing at a tree line in the pale October light of 1987, and about the woman who had watched them and turned away, and about all the other people who had known something and found reasons to keep knowing it privately, in the locked rooms of themselves, while the years accumulated. She thought about a red crayon in a plastic bag, about 41 folded notes in a wooden box, about a letter in a safety deposit box that a dying man had addressed to his son because he could not bring himself to address it to the world. Evidence is patient, she thought. The sealed room proved that. It simply waits, in the dark, holding what it holds, until someone comes with the right tools and enough stubbornness to open it. She finished her coffee and opened her laptop and began the next story. The special prosecutor's investigation took 14 months. Forrest Greel's estate, which had passed to a nephew who cooperated fully with authorities, was searched in the 4th week of the investigation. On the northeast corner of the property, in a drainage depression that a cadaver dog identified within 2 hours of arrival, investigators found additional remains. The forensic process that followed would ultimately extend the known scope of Greel's activities across nearly 2 decades and 3 counties. The final number was not made public in full, pending ongoing identification efforts, but sources close to the investigation confirmed to Vivian that the 4 unidentified individuals from the sub-level space had all been named, and that none of their families had ever been told what they most needed to know. They were told now. Elspeth Crane was interviewed formally by the Special Prosecutor's Office on 4 occasions. Her attorney was present at each session. She acknowledged, in her 4th interview, that she had escorted the 4 children back into the school building on the morning of October 14, 1987, at the instruction of Forrest Greel, who had told her they were to be taken to the lower level for a matter of school administration. She stated she had not known what would happen to them. She stated she had made herself believe over the long years that she was not responsible for what followed. The prosecutor's office spent considerable time evaluating whether this account was credible and to what degree. Vivian did not report what conclusion they reached because a legal process is not a story's conclusion. It is a separate thing entirely, with its own rules. What Vivian did report, in a follow-up piece published 8 months after the first, was that the state legislature had introduced a measure named the Whitfield Act requiring all public school buildings over 50 years old to submit to comprehensive architectural inspection against original permitted drawings. 3 schools across 2 other states introduced similar measures in the following legislative session. Whether the measures passed, and in what form, was a matter of ongoing process. Harold Mast was buried in a ceremony in Creel Hollow in the spring following the identification. His son and 2 grandchildren came from Roanoke. Dale Odom attended and stood at the back. The service was brief and the day was clear, and the oak trees on the north side of the cemetery were just beginning to produce their first green, the tentative new growth that comes every year regardless of what has happened beneath it. Vivienne was not there. She was in another small town in another state, sitting across a table from an old man with a corkboard on his wall and a set of files that the relevant authorities had decided, a long time ago, did not need examining. Margot Sisson drove to Charlottesville Municipal Police the week after Vivienne's story published and surrendered the red crayon in its plastic bag. Forensic analysis confirmed it was from the same production batch as the crayon recovered from the sub-level space. Whether they had come from the same box, whether some small hand had held both of them on the same October morning and set one down in the dark and reached the other toward an adult who was too slow and too frightened and too young to understand what was being given to her, could not be established with certainty. Some things cannot be established with certainty. This does not mean they did not happen. Tobias Drummond, Petra Vance, Callum Ashby, Nora Blythe. Their names are spoken in Creel Hollow now, openly, without the careful deflection that surrounded them for so long. A small memorial was installed on the grounds where the school once stood, 4 stones set in a row at the eastern edge of the cleared lot facing the tree line. Simple. Just the names and the dates. The grass around them grew in thick the following spring, the way grass does when soil has been disturbed and then left alone, pressing upward toward whatever light is available. It is not enough. Nothing is enough. But it is what remains, and it is true, and the names are on the stones where anyone can read them, which is more than they had for 37 years,